Due to some internal YouTube policy, I was unable to put a card at the end of my videos to promote the people who are providing my t-shirts, and so I'm having to do this and make a little video just before the main one. So I've got some merchandise, or merch if you prefer. This is a t-shirt I had done previously, and there's white and black ones. The new ones aren't going to be like that, they're going to be similar but a bit better, I think. So I'll put a little card up so you can see where to get them, where to place your orders, and I'll put a link down in the description as well. When or if this nightmare ever comes to an end, I mean, we might want to devote some time and some brain power to making sure that it never happens again, to construct a procedure that ensures that crimes must be answered for. The political class will of course resist such things, that's a given. No matter how many people in the establishment feel that Tony Blair is a war criminal, he will never be tried for such things. And it won't be because they have any residue of respect for the man, although I'm sure that some do. No, no matter how guilty they may believe him, or anyone else in a similar position to be, he will never face in court the accusations that are hurled at him in public. For one reason, and for one reason only, and it can be expressed as, "There but for the grace of God go I," or rather, if they can try Blair, they can try any of us. And no matter the revulsion that anybody in the political class may have for him, they won't feed him to the wolves. The same goes for David Cameron, Gordon Brown, Theresa May, John Major, or indeed anybody who held high political office. Up until today, the same appeared to be true in the United States, where Richard Nixon was pardoned by a successor. And although Donald Trump can count the famed boxer Jack Johnson of a conviction he received all the way back in 1913, among his 94 pardons so far, he has used this executive power to also pardon many of his friends and allies, which is broadly typical. In France, President Charles de Gaulle famously pardoned the hero of Verdun and Nazi collaborator Marshal Pétain. But I've no idea whether this practice is commonplace in the French Republic. But whether in Britain, the US or in France, the message is the same. We're different, we're special, and crucially, we're not like them. In their deranged loathing of Trump, the US elite appears to have made an exception. But then we always knew that the Orange Man was never one of them. Broadly speaking though, the them is of course us. They would argue that the reason the system of pardons, unofficial or otherwise, is to enable those who govern us to do so freely, safe in the knowledge that the decisions that they make will not come back to haunt them. How, they say, can the mighty sword of executive power be wielded effectively when one's eye is always on the possible lawsuit to come? How can the business of government attract the brightest and the best to the profession when instead of serving the nation, the possibility of prosecution is likely to drive them further into the realms of the higher salaries of the private sector? How indeed, you might say. But leaving aside the fact that the last time anyone even approaching the definition of being among the brightest and the best was probably when Margaret Thatcher was forced out in 1990. Or even, if you don't like that description, and depending on your point of view, going back to the days of Clement Attlee and Winston Churchill. Would it actually really be so bad if our leaders did, in fact, have something to focus the mind? Churchill and Attlee would have been acutely aware of the consequences of failing to wage war effectively on Nazi Germany in 1940. And look at the job they did. Defeffel Johnson and his idiot sidekick and self-described grime fan Matt Hancock are governing as if there were no tomorrow, which if they continue with their ruinous policy of national lockdowns, they may very well be proved right. Who, in all honesty, believes either one of them, or their ghoulish pair of scientists, Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty, has even the slightest consideration of how they will be judged? They don't care. Although Johnson seems to have literally given up any thoughts of his historical legacy, which is some climb down from emulating his hero Churchill, they certainly don't seem to be even mildly perturbed about any judgment that may be forthcoming. And the reason is because they know there will be no judgment, no legal one anyway. They are confident that no matter how many lives they destroy, so long as they are at present perceived to be saving them, they will be safe from any legal reckoning. It was Tony Blair's administration, coincidentally, that removed the death penalty from the only crime that still had it as a sentence: treason. Funny that. But unlike a lot of people, despicable human being that he is, I don't actually believe that Blair is guilty of treason or war crimes. Not for the debacle of Iraq, anyway. My accusation of Tony Blair is one that is loathsome enough, and one which I also level at the most craven of institutions, the British police force. Cowardice. Cowardice is not a crime, and nor should it be, for none of us can be sure how we would react in a life or death situation. But it is a vice that we should weed out as far as possible from our leaders or those, like the police force, that are meant to protect us. Refusing to go over the top to face a barrage of machine guns is not, in my book, cowardice. That is just a failure to reach the highest level of human courage at a crucial moment. And that failure may not be repeated. A man may learn to become more courageous if he is given another chance. As I have said many times before, the police are cowardly because, in the face of the most heinous crime imaginable, that of the mass gang rape of children, the police were so cowardly that they were so afraid of being called a nasty word, racist, that they not only did nothing and looked the other way, but that they continued to do nothing for decades. They had ample opportunity and countless chances to redeem themselves, and still they did nothing. They fed those children to the fucking wolves, and by their inaction enabled and facilitated the abuse of tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of underage girls. They prioritised their pensions over them. And if that's not fucking cowardice, I don't know what is. But Tony Blair's cowardice is of a different order. Not worse perhaps, but maybe even more pathetic. In the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, and in the face of the biggest protests there have ever been in Britain, Blair still went ahead and committed British troops to the invasion. Full disclosure here, I didn't protest, since I thought Saddam was continuing in his policy of brinksmanship and will back down at the last minute. So I can't say I was part of the principled opposition. But my accusation of cowardice on Tony Blair's part is of the same magnitude as that of the police. My opinion, since I don't know for sure, is that Blair was bullied by George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld and the rest. Come on, Tony, you're not going to pussy out on us now, are you? You're not going to appease Saddam like Chamberlain, are you? Where's your Churchillian spirit? It would have taken some strength of character to resist that, but it wouldn't have taken courage. Britain, quite correctly, was the first nation to line up beside the Americans after September the 11th, and it could quite reasonably and truthfully have been stated that Britain was there in America's hour of need. But the invasion of Iraq was something different. It wasn't about righteous retribution after America was attacked at home. It was regime change. Blair should have stood his ground, and he didn't. Instead, he put his loyalty to President Bush, and by extension to the United States, above his loyalty to the United Kingdom. Relations with the US would have been pretty frosty for some months, but that would have been a price worth paying for his duty to the country he led. Britain's international standing was severely damaged as a result. He plunged his country into an illegal war on the strength of some pretty flimsy evidence that turned out to be complete bullshit, all because he couldn't withstand being called names by some of the most powerful men in the world. His low-level cowardice meant that thousands of British servicemen had to dig deep to find levels of courage that Blair had so obviously failed to find in himself. Once again, cowardice. And his nauseating and grandiose lapping up of the standing ovation he received at the US Senate, as if he really was Churchill, was for me the lump of snot on top of a very shitty cake. And it is cowardice, rather than a virus, that is stalking the land at present, although you don't hear much about it. A virus obviously cares not a jot whether its victims are courageous or cowardly. That is not arguable, and it is wise for us to take care. But in our normal human desire not to die a premature death, and our equally human compassion not to cause the deaths of others, we must not sacrifice absolutely everything we have to combat it. We have a free society, or at least I hope it still is there beneath all these current regulations and diktats, and it is worth defending. If it's worth defending against marauding Nazi stormtroopers, then surely it's worth defending against the virus. The classical English liberal position is everything is permitted except that which is expressly forbidden. Those things that are expressly forbidden, murder, rape, physical violence, theft of private property, tend to be those things that are harmful to others. But in the world of COVID, merely existing and breathing God's fresh air has been turned into a thing that is potentially harmful to others, and can therefore safely be bracketed into things that can be expressly forbidden. And that's the key, you see. That's the sleight of hand. They'll say nothing's changed. They'll still say that we live in a free society that is still governed by Enlightenment values. They'll still insist that, despite not being able to protest, that we still live in a free country. They will continue to declare that, despite censoring dissident voices, deplatforming radio stations and removing internet content that is problematic, free speech still flourishes. Because that's the problem. In 5 years' time, when we are still locked down, when all of our movements are dependent on the whims of distant politicians, they still won't admit what they've done. Even those who believe themselves to have the best of intentions, in fact especially those, will never admit that, in their zeal to keep everyone safe, they will have removed that thing that actually makes life worth living. Real freedom. In saving Granny, they will not admit that they have killed Granny's spirit, and Granny's children's spirit, and that of her grandchildren. And they will pat themselves on the back for ensuring that Granny lives another year, alone, when all she really wanted was to see her grandchildren. But freedom is dangerous, and it requires a certain amount of courage to be able to enjoy it. Not an enormous amount, just a normal amount. The amount of courage an everyday person has. Even just railing against cowardice, as I increasingly do, comes with a certain amount of risk. When push comes to shove, how do I know that I'll pass the test? I don't know, and it could be that I surprise myself with how cowardly I actually am, and all of my words will evaporate and lose any power they might have had I been braver. But as pathetic as I will seem in that scenario as I cower under the stairs, it won't invalidate the argument. As I urge my compatriots to greater courage, and a courage that I've yet to demonstrate myself, the courage of others is still required. Just as I lament the parlous state that my country has fallen into, even before COVID, because of the corresponding continued neglect of it, all that is required was for us to do was just a tiny bit of the civic work to keep it in good health. Our lack of engagement in parish, town, county and national politics is what has resulted in, for instance, having a mayor in our capital city that appears to care more about a career criminal who was killed by an American policeman 4,000 miles away than about the Londoners who elected him. It has never been the case that we all needed to spend every second of our free time dedicating ourselves to making sure the bins are emptied. All we had to do was engage, just a little bit. Just as it has never been the case that any of us are required to have extraordinary amounts of courage. We don't need to be heroes like our grandfathers. We just need to be men. Those ordinary men did extraordinary things and demonstrated extraordinary bravery. And they did those things for us, mostly so we wouldn't have to. And the fact that there's been peace in Europe for 75 years will have pleased them. I'm sure it will have. They would have been pleased to know that we not only enjoyed peace, but we also enjoyed the freedom that went with it. But they didn't expect us to act like pussies. They would, I'm sure, have expected us to at least have enough courage to actually enjoy the freedom that they paid for, some of them with their lives. They would, I feel sure, have felt that they had made the world safe enough so that we can enjoy freedom. But they would also, I suspect, have expected us to stand up for it when it was threatened. They would have expected us to cherish and nurture it, and that we would value it enough to be willing to fight for it. And in the last 10 months it has been assaulted as never before. And what's more, those that have attempted to defend freedom have been traduced and insulted, accused of being callous, of being eugenicists, and even in some cases accused of murder. Defence of freedom has been attacked, as it always is in times of hazard, as a frippery and an indulgence compared to the emergency of the virus. How can you be so selfish as to think of something so unimportant as freedom when there are lives at stake, is the common refrain. How dare you concern yourself with your civil liberties? We're trying to save Granny's life here. And always in such times it requires definite effort and not a little moral courage to stand one's ground. Tony Blair, him again, famously attempted to bulldoze through the most draconian legislation after the London bombings in 2005, which would have allowed the police to arrest and detain anyone for suspicion of terrorism for 90 days. That's 3 months without charge. As we know, 3 months is ample time for a person to lose a job, a business, a home, a relationship or a marriage. Remember, that's without charge. Effectively, that means without concrete evidence. That means they can keep you locked up for 90 days and at the end of the 90th day release you, having come up with nothing to build a case against you. Only the suspicion of the police is sufficient. Thankfully, and unusually, some principled Tories, led by David Davis, got it reduced to 28 days. But that's still a month, which is 21 days more than it had been before. But being locked up by the government, despite having done nothing wrong, is now not only commonplace, it's actually the norm. They say the first casualty of war is the truth, but in the war on terror and the so-called war on the virus, it is liberty that is the first thing to be chucked overboard. But truth is also sacrificed, and in a lasting way, because in everybody's headless chicken dash to do something, people will not remember, and more importantly, they will not acknowledge the damage that they've done. In 5 years' time, when we're all still wearing masks and social distancing and allowing the government to tell us where we can go, at what time and with whom, despite many millions having obediently taken the vaccine, those lockdown enthusiasts, from the Prime Minister to the Health Secretary to the ghouls of Sage to your neighbour who snitched on you to the police, they will never own up to their part in ruining the country and removing everybody's liberty. They won't own up to it. They won't take the blame for reversing almost 1,000 years of expanding liberty in a mere 10 months. The most deluded of them will still insist, despite all evidence before their very eyes, that Britain remains a free country. Those are the ones that would have still insisted that the Titanic was unsinkable, even as they were plunged into the icy waters of the North Atlantic, having refused to swap their dinner jackets for life jackets. Some will pardon themselves, saying that they never voted for this, conveniently forgetting, and hoping that others will also forget, that it was their inaction and their failure to summon up even the flimsiest resistance that ushered in the fascism. Others will blackmail their own memories and their own consciences and insist that it was necessary at the time, and that maybe freedom isn't quite the thing of value that we believed it to be. And still others will swear blind that it was always so, and that anybody who disagrees, assisted by the endless amount of history having been poured down the memory hole by Twitter, Facebook and Google, will be considered a dangerous conspiracy theorist and liberty denier. We were always at war with East Asia, silly. We will become so accustomed to our chains that we will no longer even see them. Some people even do this now, and some of them, I have to say, among my contributors, who pour scorn on my naivety that we were ever free. As I say, I believe that cowardice is the worst of human traits, but cowardice, just like courage, starts small. To ridicule the idea that we were ever free is, if I may say, a particularly pernicious and spineless position from which to start. To those that say it, it may seem as if you are being brutally realistic, when all about you are indulging in a naive fantasy. Perhaps it makes you feel as if it is you alone that has the courage to look at life square in the eye, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. Perhaps it just makes you feel more intelligent than those around you. But just as the zealot conceals a hidden doubt, maybe what you doubt is your own ability to believe in something better and have the courage to fight for it, all the while knowing that you may not get it. Because to throw oneself into a battle whose conclusion is unknown is to demonstrate moral courage. We all know what happened to Winston Smith when he first rebelled by writing "Down with Big Brother" in his notebook. We know what happened to him. What if you spend all that effort in fighting what turns out to be an inevitable defeat? What if you choose the wrong side? What if you encourage others to take up the fight, only for them to blame you when they end up defeated, imprisoned, crippled or dead? What happens when it's you tied to a chair in room 101 with starving rats in a cage strapped to your face? Much better to declare the inevitability of defeat and the futility of resistance from the start, eh? But that's not courage. That's its opposite. That's moral cowardice, unconvincingly disguised as realism. So we are going to have to fight for this, and as soft and as squishy and as comfortable as we all are, perhaps that's no bad thing. We may not have to face a 50 cal machine gun when the landing craft door drops down, but we're probably going to have to fight just as hard in different ways. Maybe we've had it too good for too long, and maybe 75 years is too long for most of us that have never really had to fight for anything. At the moment, the thought of living in a totalitarian state is still just theoretical for most of us, as the horrors are at present in our imaginations rather than our memories. Although the images of the jackboot are beginning to filter through, as evidenced by that video of the police forcing their way into a family home in Glasgow with their epileptic daughter screaming in terror. It's a dark premonition. Something wicked this way comes. But as the lockdown continues and burns through our civic society, stripping us of our prosperity, our jobs, our homes, our futures and our very humanity, it will leave us, if taken to its logical conclusion, with nothing left to lose. But those that have visited this calamity upon us, either by incompetence or malice, need to be made aware that they, by contrast, have everything to lose. They need to know that retribution, like justice, can reach all the way to them. We've got to be able to lock them up.